Witamy Państwa bardzo serdecznie. Nazywam się Justyna Boduch, jestem członkiem Stowarzyszenia Architektów Polskich w Katowicach. Z kolegą Wojciechem Fudalą witamy Państwa oraz zapraszamy do wzięcia w dzisiejszym wykładzie. Dzisiejszy wykład jest częścią programu zatytułowanego W stronę innowacyjnej dydaktyki przyszłości oraz doskonałości naukowej. Jest to projekt międzynarodowej współpracy z profesorem Thomasem Micalem z Auckland University of Technology. Beneficjentami programu są zarówno pracownicy wspomnianego instytutu, jak i studenci prowadzonych przez Instytut Kierunków Studiów Kulturoznawstwa oraz Kultur Mediów. Uczestniczą w nim ponadto pracownicy naukowi oraz studenci Wydziału Architektury Politechniki Śląskiej w Gliwicach, gdyż wykład jest zarówno prowadzony dla Państwa oraz dla architektów. Pokrótce Fuda przedstawi dalszą część.
Witam wszystkich bardzo serdecznie. Tak jak wspomniała Justyna, reprezentuję katowicki oddział Stowarzyszenia Architektów Polskich i chciałem powiedzieć kilka słów o naszym stowarzyszeniu, które jest jednym ze współorganizatorów wydarzenia obok Uniwersytetu Śląskiego oraz Politechniki Śląskiej. SARP zajmuje się szeroko pojętą integracją środowiska architektów. Jest jedną z dwóch kluczowych polskich instytucji architektonicznych obok Izby Architektów Polskich. SARP zajmuje się organizacją konkursów publicznych, przy których organizacji współpracuje z miastem Katowice i innymi śląskimi miastami. SARP zajmuje się także organizacją wydarzeń architektonicznych, między innymi cyklu Mistrzowie Architektury, polegającego na sprowadzaniu do Katowic zagranicznych, znanych architektów, którzy tutaj lokalnie na Śląsku opowiadają o swoich realizacjach.
Inicjatywa uzyskała dofinansowanie Górnośląskiej Zagłębiowskiej Metropolii w ramach programu Metropolitalny Fundusz Wspierania Nauki w latach 2019-2022. Patronem medialnym spotkania jest właśnie Metropolia oraz Architektura i Biznes. Zapraszam serdecznie na wykład.
Okay, so I would like to introduce our today's guest lecturer, Professor Thomas Micalem. He asked me to do it as shortly as possible, so I will try to keep it short. So Professor Micalem has been teaching and researching globally on modern and hypermodern theories of architecture and urbanism over his long career in diverse international architecture programs. He studied in Harvard. Now he is teaching at Jindal University of Technology. And I would like to introduce for his today's lecture, which and its title is Sense, Data and Psyche in Modern Spaces. So Professor Micalem, please tell us about your vision of architecture and philosophy.
Thank you. Thank you for the welcome, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to this large virtual audience. I'm very happy to be virtually in Katowice, and I'm talking to quite a few people since the SOL conference a couple months ago. And it's a fascinating opportunity for me to share, I guess, some insights to people in a range of different experiences and backgrounds. I'll talk a little bit about some ideas about sense and sense making in cities. I will make some reference to my hometown of Chicago, and people might recognize from my name, my grandparents were Polish, but I don't speak Polish, unfortunately, I'm American. So I'll do the presentation in English, and I will try to speak as clearly as I can because of the internet issues. So here I'm going to load my presentation, and then I will be speaking as I show you images. So again, thank you for inviting me, and I hope that I can show you some interesting ways to understand how we make sense of cities. Sense, in terms of what sense means, is actually a complex term. And not to make it too philosophical, I want to talk about the ways that sense works in how we recognize and move and understand things. sense can have two different meanings in English. When something makes sense, we say that it has logic to it, logical sense, cause and effect, or relations that make sense. The second meaning of sense is different, and that has to do with our sensory organs, our sensations, vision, touch, hearing. These are all different senses that sometimes can contradict what we think should be logical, what we think should be rational. In some ways, the difference between what is logical and what the senses tell us is actually the human condition. That's part of being alive. When things don't quite make sense, or when there are sensations that we can't quite understand, this is actually an important part of being in the world. This is something that is part of being human and is also part of being in a city. We go back a long time to the origins of the Enlightenment science. The human mind and our ability to understand things, to make sense of things, was grounded in a scientific model. For something to make sense, it had to make sense to everyone. For something to be sensical, it had to have logic to it. Maybe not mathematics, but certainly in the human mind, it had to have a logical consistency. This means for something to make sense to us, we would have to talk to others or to test it or to find validation or verification. For something to make sense, it has to come to us first through our sense organs. We can see something, we can hear something, and then we will interpret that phenomena, and that interpretation is where we make sense of it. We impose a meaning on the data that is streaming into our eyes and into our ears. You can think of the city as a type of large multimedia experience. The Kantian term would be the noumena, but we can also talk about the city as an environment. A city is a place that we explore, discover, but also a place where we make routine, where we make habit, where we impose a routine or a habit as a way of making sense of the world. We will talk about how this works in ideas of our lived space, but in this document from the Enlightenment, or in the early 18th century, we can see that the human mind was already conceived of as having memory, of having reason, and even a small place for the imagination. So a lot of times when we try to make sense of things, we will use our experience, our memories. We can use logic and reason, but we also have to use our imagination. And each of these three branches of the mind, of the human science it's called, allows us to make sense of things in different ways. So we ourselves are very complex mechanisms. We have in our heads very complex ways of understanding and interpreting the world and producing values, producing meanings, producing sense of the world through the streaming media that comes from experiencing the city. Diderot's encyclopedia in the end was an attempt to capture what rational understanding of the materials of the world would look like. We live in a material world, and with the rise of modernism, with the rise of industrialization, we also have the rise of materialism. The idea that explanations can be found in the material world, not in some other world. This turn towards reason, towards rationalism, had a strong influence on the development of architecture, design, and cities. Rational planning, thinking in terms of logical causality, thinking in terms of temporal cycles, thinking in terms of material causes as well as material effects, became stronger in discussions, stronger in politics, and more visible in the built environment. As things such as sacred numbers, sacred geometry, magic, mysticism, and myth faded in importance, science of enlightenment prioritized rational thinking, of working with tools to produce effects and produce results, to thinking about objects in their different configurations and comparing them, analyzing them, evaluating them, rationalizing them. Here you can see, for example, the drawing and the manufacturing tools or the footwear, all cataloged as part of this encyclopedic idea to capture what is available in the material world. Science begins by observation. The science of rationalism, or the science of the human sciences, also is based on an empirical model of gathering data or gathering information. The earliest versions of the scientific method were based on finding data, observing it, recording it, testing it, and comparing it with others. A phenomena that could not be repeated was not science. To understand a phenomena, to understand a situation, and to be able to predict the future with that was the goal of the scientific method in its medieval and earlier versions. Here you can see an illustration, a whimsical illustration of a space for learning. This is an observation room for young doctors and scientists to see and understand how the human body works. The body was considered as a sacred site and was not intended to be opened or to be dissected. But with the push for science and for understanding the world, the search for knowledge, the idea of human anatomy, the idea that the human body is composed of systems, the idea that the human body is the location of much knowledge, became an object of analysis in science. The anatomical theater we are seeing here is structured a bit like a theater in the round, not as a performance space, but as a demonstration space. This attempt to make sense of what is happening in the body, this attempt to make sense of how the body works as systems, is the basis for the medical sciences. And you can see in this illustration, which is part fantasy, part fact, we can start to see how the skeletons of other animals are also crowding around the performance space. In this way, we can also see how rationalism always has room for the irrational or for the unexpected or the unusual. And this is also part of our sensory apparatus. It is not the everyday things that we notice, but when something changes that we notice. So our sensory organs, our eyes, our ears, our fingertips, allow us to make sense of the world through touch, through sight, and through sound. But they also allow us to make sense of the world afterwards, as we think, as we reflect, as we compare. Given this situation, if we understand the world as a type of production of streaming media, as a production of data, as a world composed of phenomena that are shifting and changing, it is possible to think about spaces as things that change also. Our consciousness is moving from idea to idea, from experience to experience, from sensation to sensation. Our consciousness is a type of process or flow. Our bodies are processes and flows. Our bodies have different cycles and rhythms. The world does too. The sun, the seasons come in predictable rhythms, and this becomes the basis of ritual and a mythic reserve. But also, there are other processes and flows that come as surprise. Spaces themselves are changing. The temperatures will change, the pollution count will change, the degree of light will change. Spaces are also changing as bodies are changing and as time is changing. In this world, this complex world, we can imagine multiple different processes, multiple different rhythms, superimposing, interlacing, interconnecting, canceling each other out. We can imagine a world composed of different forms of streaming data, of different sorts of media coming and going and proliferating. If we think about how form is created, in this case, we're looking at a painting, and it's an illustration of how we make sense of things. Seveso drops paint into water and then photographs it. When we look at this, we might see this as clothing or some biological form, maybe something from the ocean. What we're looking at is just paint falling through water. But our eyes and our mind will impose a meaning on this formless form. We will make sense of what is a sensation. We will start to see in it patterns. We will start to see in it mass or volume. We will impose a meaning on it, a direction, even a movement of time. Our minds have great abilities at pattern recognition and synthesizing different data streams to produce instant interpretations, instant meanings. This allows us to understand that space produces sense in the way that space also has sense. And by this, what I'm talking about is a type of phenomena, understanding the situations, the events, the moments, the habits, the routines of the world. Your daily passages and your once-a-year special activities, think of Christmas coming up, produce a range of sensations that over time can be quite predictable, and you can actually anticipate them. In the short term, or a small child, everything is new. Everything is a surprise. Everything is filled with wonder. Over time, you will become habituated. You will make sense, and then you will categorize, and then you will naturalize. So the things that used to surprise us will become normal. This is the case, for example, when I go from country to country. Every time I go to a new country, I'm always asking, why do you do this? Why do you do it that way? And everyone says, we have always done it this way. And I say, oh, but in this country, they do it this way. And in this country, they do it that way. And people go, oh, that sounds very strange or very magical. And I say, no, when you go there, like when I was in Chicago, when I explained in New Zealand how people do things in Chicago, they thought that that sounds very strange. When I told people in Chicago what people in New Zealand do, they say, oh, they're a different kind of strange. And this is part of the process of understanding sense making. It is not the things that are identical or similar that get our attention over time. It's the things that change. And so we have to attend to, learn, listen, focus on subtle changes in the environment. This is what I also mean by the sense of. Those of you in architecture will know the significance of the Noli Map of Rome. For people who are perhaps in other fields, Rome represents a very significant point of departure in the Western intellectual tradition, not simply as the unplanned city of planned city generations, the Roman cities. It is also at the umbilicus, it was the center of the measure of the earth. And in this drawing, we see a very particular way of sense making using mapping techniques. This is the Noli Map from the 1700s. And what happens in the Noli Map, which is quite fascinating, is we don't see individual buildings. We don't see streets. We don't see infrastructure per se. The mapping technique here is not conventional in the way that we understand map making now. This is a map making exercise with a different process. This is trying to show Rome as a body. And what that means is Rome is composed of a tissue, a fabric, a density. Buildings are not shown here. The entire city block is shown as one consistent texture, one consistent volume. So each of the blocks composed of sometimes hundreds of buildings are shown as one solid. It talks about community and connection. But what he's done in this map is he's made the streetscapes, the streets, the plazas, the outdoor space, the spaces that are have no roof but the clouds. He's left them as white space, as open. And for the city tissues, the density, the stones, the bricks, the private spaces, those are dark space. They are mysterious from the outside. They are unknown. This is a map making of someone who walks the streets and records the data of the outside. But what Noli does in between the Pantheon here and the Piazza Navona, a very important historical area, is he starts to carve space out of the tissue, of the density, of the fabric. Whenever someone can go into a public space inside a building, he draws it in white to say that public space, even when it's an interior, belongs to the street and belongs to the society. And so now you can start to see those white spaces in between the streets that are churches, basilicas, museums, other public institutions. We can now see them as an extension of the street or an extension of the public realm. It visualizes the social. It allows us to see not just inside and outside, public and private, but we start to see how they interconnect. Like a body, we're almost looking at a different type of system. We could imagine this being the skeletal bones of the skeletal system, or the veins in the circulation of blood system, or the linings of the lung in the respiration system. We are looking at a drawing that has insides, outsides, and something in between. And it's a very sophisticated drawing because it maps connections, networks, and spaces that are public. It does not care about private property or windows or building heights. It is a mapping of the connective tissue of the city, the spaces that are open to the public that allow us to make sense of the city. And this map this is a fragment of a map that's over 300 years old. It changed the way people think about how to map cities and creates a way to think about future mapping too. I've been working with some students in cultural studies, anthropology, architecture, a lot of other areas, explaining how we make sense of cities in the way that I learned it. I learned it from Kevin Lynch in his book, The Image of the City, where he tried to figure out why people in Boston never get lost. And they never get lost because the city has some very strong clues about building a mental map of the city. If you visit Boston or you live in Boston, or Katowice, you will have a mental map that you build over time. The tourist will not have a mental map and they will get lost. The people who live there will have a mental map and be able to find their way and to give directions and to even help figure out how to get to places they have not been to. To do this, Kevin Lynch says we actually use different ways of making sense. Going from the right to the left, he said every city that is legible, every city that can be mapped mentally using your psyche, not using your phone or GPS, you can build a mental map by having clear districts. So his analysis, his research, also became the basis of good city planning for walkable cities and for cities that are navigatable and cities that have clear identities. So these are the secret formula. One, have clear, distinct districts. That means in each zone, in each neighborhood, the building should be similar. But when you change a zone or you change neighborhoods, like in many cities, you go from one side that's very rich to another side that's very poor. The change of district should be visible. The buildings have to be consistent in that neighborhood, but change between neighborhoods. You can think of them as different organs. For this to also happen, for a city to be legible, it needs to have edges between one neighborhood and another. This does not mean gated communities. What it means is something where each district, each neighborhood has a distinct character, a distinct building technique, a distinct feel, a distinct quality. This is what's disappearing in globalization, by the way. The edges between things, the boundaries between things dissolve, and you wind up with a world where things all look the same or similar, and it's very easy to get lost. The third element are landmarks. Those will be your monuments, your clock towers, your castles, your significant buildings, your historic sites. Landmarks become unique moments, unique points for navigation. And there's been many people who have worked in so-called new urbanism that particularly for walkable cities, you should have a landmark no farther than 10 minutes walk from the next landmark so that people can become interconnected and never get lost. The node is a decision-making point. It is an intersection, a crossroads. It is where you have to decide where to go from one point to another. And it's composed of paths. Paths are those white areas in the Noli Map. They are streets, they are alleys, they are walkways, they can be pathways through a garden, but paths are lines of mobility, streets, rail lines, trails, anything that connects in a linear system for people to walk is a path. The more important the path, the more of an axis it becomes. But Lynch said, writing this in the 70s and 80s, that the city of Boston and the process of wayfinding is based on this principle of making sense of the city by breaking it into these recurring parts and composing this in your head through habit and experience. The production of space, particularly in the period since industrialization, has been based on repetition. Solid spaces get spaces inserted within them that have spaces inserted within them. And we start to have conditions like this, where the solid starts to turn into something that is more open and perforated. You can see the cubicles on the left in Tati's Playtime, or in Eisenstein's film on the right of the farmers hiding in the harvest baskets. And we can start to imagine that space is filled with smaller spaces, and that spaces are based on bigger spaces too. So as we move from private space to social space to urban space, this idea of being inside another thing that is inside another thing, is a very important way of understanding how we move from the scale of the individual to the scale of the city. This is the basis for neighborhoods and for social relationships. Now I'd like to talk about sense data, given the idea that we now have some ideas how to make sense of space in the abstract. If we think about how we understand and navigate the world, one of the most powerful tools for making sense of space and making sense of the world is our body. Not only does it house different sense organs, it is constantly in dynamic interaction with the world around it. There is a Laurie Anderson song where she said, when you're walking, you're falling, and then you stop yourself with your foot, and then you start again. So it's falling and stopping and falling and stopping. And this is the principle of locomotion and propulsion that creates almost like a cinematic rhythm here. You can see Duchamp, an artist, descending a staircase in stop action photography, or Edward Murray, one of the first to study the movement of the human body. And you can see how he's chalked the locations of the head, the major limbs. They use this a lot now in motion capture for CGI-based filmmaking, with this idea of tracking the body three-dimensionally through points. But all of these are just representations of that slight interval between one position and another that forms the basis of process, of flow, of movement. You can think of ourselves, like the philosopher Henry Bernson did, as little cameras walking around the world, observing and sensing and having that sense of enchantment and wonder and analyzing, interpreting. We move through the world, we move through the environment, and we respond to that environment. As Winston Churchill famously said, we shape that environment, and that environment then shapes us. And this means that as we move through the world as observers or as participants, the world also has a reciprocating action to us. Even if we are just quiet observers, our presence becomes something that others can observe too. So we are always in a relationship. We are always correlating to other people. We're always correlating one sensation or one pattern to the next. And this is how we can understand how each of the moments of our lives connect together into a lifetime. But we can also think in a city how each space connects to form the city itself too. This process of chaining together different experiences, of combining different visions, is the basis of perception, of art, and of science. I'm showing you an interesting fundamental problem that was solved with the development of photography. To make sense of the appearance of the running horse, and if you've ever seen a real horse running, they're large and they're very fast, and it's an amazing thing to see something as powerful as a horse move as lightly and quickly as it does. For a long time, people used to wonder, is there any point when a horse is galloping that all of its four legs are off the ground? It seems like they should be, but it happens so fast you can't really see it. And using this stop motion technique, Muybridge did an experiment in one of the earliest works of photography of placing cameras along a path to document the movement of a horse. And in that process, he used technology to show what the human eye and mind suspected, but could not prove. What he was showing was the fact that actually, yes, the horse does leave the ground quite often. But because we don't see the world in those intervals, we see it as a smooth movement. This also tells us about how important it is to connect things and to think of things as connections. That the horse never stops being a horse, the rider doesn't stop being a rider, but in every moment, there's a movement from the past to the future. This is a photograph by the Parisian photographer Auger. And I often turn to photography, like mapping, as a way of understanding or making sense of cities. Auger was doing the same thing as well. He was an unusual figure in that he went around and he took photographs, not for commercial pleasure, but to capture the parts of Paris that were disappearing with modernization. He was recording the transformation of the city of Paris from a medieval to a modern city by finding moments in the city, finding spaces where both the old and the new were in close proximity, and using his camera to document this juncture, this connection between the past and the future. In doing so, he prioritized a recording technique using black and white photography and daguerreotypes that captures that movement in our imagination between one space and another, but also the passage of time. In a city, spaces are spaces of flows. Time flows, bodies flow, light flows, and all of these different flows move in and through the space and can be perceived. If you stand in the place long enough, this plaza will fill with people, and then at night it will empty again. So we can already understand intuitively the movements of the flows of people and light through the city. The camera allowed us to stop that and capture it. And Auger, in his work, tried to capture that haunting quality of being between spaces, of being between times, of being something like a translator or a translation machine between these two different temporalities and two different spaces. It's that condition of being inside the city and observing the city that set him up as an amazing photographer. And that's kind of what we do when we're not taking selfies of ourselves, but we're taking pictures of other things. We cease to be in that space for a minute and we become observers. We lose our identity into the camera lens, which can be dangerous if you're doing it in an area with a lot of transport or exposed sewers or things too. There's risk there. But this is the principle of the idea of documenting and recording, of using technology, even your phone, as a proxy, as a second extension to your eye, to record things that you might not be able to see, but are still streaming into your consciousness. This is why Walter Benjamin said that we have an optical unconscious, that photography has taught us to see things that before we ignored. In my hometown of Chicago and many places, urban situations, United States, when the Bauhaus relocated to the new Bauhaus in Chicago with Mies, Moholy-Nagy, Hilbersheimer, and others, there was a series of photographs done. I think Moholy-Nagy got a lot of people to do this, fascinated with the technologies of the fire escape, which was developed as a response to urban fires and building codes. They became objects of aesthetic pleasure in an industrial aesthetic. And here you can see how the camera reveals an aspect of modern life that became not a second infrastructure or something that builds community, but a fundamental necessity to save human life. The ethical requirement of architects to preserve human life at the expense of other things, even real estate, is manifested in the fire escapes. But with the hands of a camera and a good lens and a good eye, they can also be turned into sculptural objects. We can also start to see the severe beauty of industrialization and how it attaches or is attached to the older buildings. So in the same way that Auger showed us old Paris and new Paris, you can also see, even in something as simple as a metal fire escape, old architecture and new architecture. And so every vision of the city that we take as an image captures the past, captures the present, and anticipates the future. In this way, we can say not only are bodies and light flowing through space, but also, obviously, time. Consider how the urban flows work in a modern city. Individuals are directed through public transport, through stairs, through circulation systems, through plazas, through parks, in a very coded language that we learn to read very young. We start to learn how to move through a city. We learn where to walk, how to walk. We learn how to avoid, how to pass, when's an appropriate amount to stop and where. There's a whole bunch of very subtle codes and clues in urban space that tell us how to behave. And we make sense of the city by making sense of these codes. We learn the protocols, the rhythms, the routines. We learn to form habits out of this. When I was in Chicago working as an architect, I would always take the elevated train home at night. And I didn't need to look out of the windows. I knew the sound of the tracks, the stop before my stop, and I could actually sleep on the train. And when the sound of the train tracks changed slightly, I knew to wake up because I had 1 minute to get to my stop. So over time, you will become accustomed to these other markers, these other rhythms, and they will become sense-making devices for you. The sound of the change of the train tracks as it went around a curve and the gauge of the train, the slope of it changed, was enough to trigger my body to wake up and to make sense of the fact that it became a landmark. It meant I had 1 more minute before my stop at Damon stop arrived. If we think about urban flows, the camera allows us to capture what we perceptually naturalize, which is the movement from one space to another, or the transition from one zone to another. And we can see in photography too, how making sense of the city is something that we have to do in real time, live, three-dimensionally, in our bodies, in our flesh, and there's no do-overs. And again, it's quite amazing that we were able to do that. Even in fields of perception, cognition, robotics, they're still not a robot that's as good at going upstairs and getting into a train as human beings. So even the physics of it is quite fascinating that we can do all of this. We also know that in a city that there are opportunities for us to be mysterious, to be invisible, to, in some cases, disappear into the spaces. We don't all have to be in front of the camera all of the time. It is also possible in a city to become anonymous, for us to diminish or to make ourselves low resolution, in the same way that a lot of industrial spaces, by taking away human scale, by taking away material conditions, by taking away all of those codes and markers that allow us to quickly make sense of where we are and where we should go. By eliminating these, it is possible to create other types of architecture, other types of space, and other types of blurred identities. As you can see in this photograph, the deeper we get into a blurred space, the less clear it becomes. The same can be said of how we perceive a new place. When we first come to a new place, it is often mentally blurry to us. We don't know how to make sense of it. We don't know which codes to read. We don't know which landmarks or which edges are significant. And we can lose ourselves. We can lose our identity in those situations where we are disoriented, where there is no sense or nonsense. I want to talk now about the idea of space as a place that we live, as something that in many ways is our most significant production. If we look at the ideas of Lefebvre and others, we can imagine that even in the contemporary times, imagining ideal spaces, trying to think, what sort of space do we want to live in? What sort of space would be good for us? What sort of space do we deserve? These questions have often fascinated designers and people working in fields as diverse as interior design to sociology. This is an image from my childhood. That's not me, but I wish it was. I wish my parents had an underwater house where I could go swimming every day. And I grew up in Chicago, so this was not very common. But if you look very closely, you can start to see how this representation from a science magazine showing the house of the future basically duplicated what was already the case. The American dream was to own a house, have a middle-class nuclear family. You can see the television, which was a social marker, but also access to the outside world. And then the one element in this that is surprising and different, that the window to the outside is actually a glass onto an aquarium or a swimming pool. This is just one of thousands of illustrations you can find, and I've seen some in Poland too, of what people in the 1950s and 60s thought today would look like. It's a fascinating era to look back at those older projections and to see how the future has or has not turned out the way it was supposed to. We can see, for example, in this photograph from a magazine, the buildings in Chicago called Marina City. This is, again, the nuclear family, not as a rendering, but as a photograph, a stage photograph, enjoying a soda, the same sort of culture, the same sort of class markers, the same sort of adventurous lifestyle being indicated by the tasteful modern architecture and the mid-century modern furniture. And if you look through the curtains, you'll notice that the room is actually curved. If you look farther, you see the balconies of the next building, which is the same complex called Marina City, also have curvatures to them. So there's something slightly unusual about this building of urban life. This is the sort of lifestyle you might expect to see in a suburban house outside the city. And what we have here is that suburban lifestyle of the upper middle class and the security that that image brings to people who grew up in that context as an ideal, showing up as an advertising image, but inserted back into the city. This is what a living room in a suburban house would look like if it was 30 floors above the ground next to the Chicago River. Here, lived space is the space where everyday life happens. The table would be used for dining, but also for homework and for puzzles and for games. And the table would probably be one of the most highly effective tools in the house as a place for entertainment, performance, as a place for debate, as a place for learning, as a place for eating and other things too. The table itself is one of the most significant parts of the interior of any dwelling, particularly if it is a socially used or collectively understood table, because in many ways the table, like a plaza or a public space in a city, a table stages the forms of relationships of the people in the space. Unless, of course, you're throwing a party, then everyone usually goes to the kitchen and ignores the tables, but that's an exception. A very popular show when I was a little kid was the Flintstones, about the Stone Age people living in many ways in an American lifestyle. And then after a couple of years, because of the space race and the Cold War, the Jetsons were invented. And the Jetsons presented an image of the future. So for Americans, my age and older, the Jetsons represented a 1960s, the development of color television was a technological marvel. And this animated series showed what life in the future would be like. People lived in buildings, as you can see, far above the clouds, and they would commute to work in flying cars, a recurring fantasy. George Jetson would often go to work on a conveyor belt to connect to these different floating cities. The imagery comes from the space age and perhaps even obscure references to the Russian avant-garde, combined with a fantasy of a highly technological and efficient, almost utopian society where there's very few issues or problems that happen, and mechanical problems were often downplayed as a technological fantasy. The design of it, if you look there, has actually been laid out, and that's one of the homes done for the series. So for these cartoon illustrations of the future city, they would actually hire architects and different types of exhibition designers to lay out the actual settings. You can see the same sort of projection of the fantasy in Liz Saarinen General Motors headquarters in Michigan. Here, the showroom of the space has an almost science fiction quality to it, like the Jetsons, but grounded in the reality. You can see by the cars how old this photograph is. And what is curious to look at, if we talk about photographs showing past, present, and future, what is curious to look at is how the architecture looks less dated than the cars, and the clothing even less dated too. The clothing of the businessmen wearing the suits is still acceptable today. Those cars would be seen as antiques, and the architecture would be seen as perhaps late functionalism, but certainly not completely out of style, but probably needing a rehab or an upgrade. As you can see here is a more contemporary photograph of that same space, which is intended to be a showroom, but also a representation of how modern space has within it a projection or a fantasy of its own future. To design something in the contemporary, to design something for today, whether it's a hairstyle, a dress, a car, a building, or a city, to design those for today, you still have to anticipate what the future will look like, how much things will cost, what will be sustainable, what materials would still exist, and increasingly how you'll dispose of it when you're done with it. This thinking in the future and designing for the future is the basis for a lot of education today in the design fields and related fields. Let's jump into some specifics. I was told that everyone likes to know stories. So I'm going to talk about a building in Chicago for a little bit to make this more real, Marina City. Marina City is that double skyscraper built out of concrete that is based on a circular building and circular patios. It is very scientific in the sense that it is a clear expression structurally of this will or this impulse to maximize the floor plate and minimize the skin. So a sphere or a circle usually does that. If we look at the image of the building itself, it's split into two different parts. And the surfaces are almost identical on each of the balconies and windows, but there's a little bit of difference between them that creates a visual pattern that we will look at more closely. The structural system is concrete, load-bearing, and the lower part is actually a spiral car park, and the upper part are the individual housing units. A lot of people would jokingly call it the corn cob building because the two of them together, as we shall see, look like the ears of corn. The building was designed by Bertrand Goldberg, and it's called Marina City, and it sits on the Chicago River. It was designed as a housing tower that was in many ways a pioneer approach towards construction. It was built with a solid core. The idea was that there's a core in the center that has all of the elevators, all of the bathrooms, all of the wiring, all of the different systems of the building, structure, circulation, mechanical. Basically, all of this, the systems you would find in a human body are compressed into the cylindrical core. And from it, these floor plates and these units come out from that central core. Everything is projected out from this central core, and so that's why the circle is so effective. As you can see here, people customize their own units in this high-tech, ultra-sleek, minimalist approach towards urban living. It quite literally levitates above the river. You can see the river there in the middle of downtown, just in the area between River North and the city center called the Loop. The building, you can think of it in some ways, is like a stack of plates. And these plates have been stacked so that everyone gets a view from their apartment to the wider city. And no one in one apartment can see what's going on to the next apartment. So you get privacy, and you also get this ability to observe everyone else in the city. It's like being in your own private camera looking down and across at the rest of the city, and everyone gets a different view. So each view is slightly different. There's a lot of metaphors and there's a lot of meanings in the way that this has been structured. The floor plan itself included, as you can see, a skating rink and the theater, a performing center. There's even a restaurant and the boat slips that's now been done into a river walk, so it connects to the other buildings. And as you can see, the spaces themselves get customized. So even in this high-tech experimental project, because it was unique as a building structure and unique as a housing typology, this building was the introduction of the new into a historic city. The origin of modern architecture can be traced to the first skyscrapers in Chicago, for example, after the Chicago fire. You also notice how people will naturalize or make normal what others would find shocking, living or recreating here on the balcony, for example. And this was the view of the skating rink, showing how in an urban environment, close proximity of housing to other spaces makes those spaces stay alive, fills them with data, fills them with people, fills them with potential. Real estate agents will know it also fills it with commerce, that the more active the space is, the more eyes and families living around it, the more versatility, diversity, and the more sustainable urbanism that is likely to happen because of the spaces of connectivity. You can see how this skating rink next to these tall buildings is a little bit like the table in the house. It brings different people together in an organized space informally to interact with each other. It creates an environment within an environment, a space within a space, and a place where individuals can feel part of a larger group if they so wish, but are also free to access it and leave it too. It is a space that produces sense. On the left, you can see the construction images of the towers as they were being built around the core. That's a photograph of the site under construction, taken from across the river. You can also see at the ground level an early photograph of people enjoying the restaurant and the bridge next to it as well. So what you have is something that's a bit of a consumerist lifestyle inserted into a rapidly urbanizing city, the city of Chicago. You can also see how the importance of things like daylight and access to public transport and circulation and different varieties of spatial experiences all add value, all produce a type of sense that allows us to recognize this city as Chicago. It's not just the buildings themselves or the people, but the relationship between them that produces the sense of the city. I'll mention now the idea of how we come to frame things, because this helps us understand, particularly since the development of photography, how the world operates in making sense of the urban. In the Misesian tradition, in the tall skyscrapers that have been done since industrialization, particularly in Chicago, there's a style of office building, and sometimes now housing, that follows the same logic, where each unit, each floor, each space is like a little window or a little cell, or you can think of it also in terms of a grid or a table. You might even imagine, like maybe someone in real estate or maintenance, that this building is like a spreadsheet, that each cell has data produced in it or things to be tracked. And we also have that beautiful peekaboo effect of looking into slices of other spaces, peeking into someone else's business, seeing a variety of different people behaving, again, from that special position of being the distant observer, but feeling like we can look inside of their lives. This density, this proximity, this way of seeing from inside and across and through other spaces is part of the acceleration that's happening with technology that allows us to feel a greater sense of control and a greater sense of wonder at the complexity of the world. We can quite literally see in this office building dozens of different ways to organize space, dozens of different ways to work in that organized space. We can also start to see differences between spaces, and we start to see differences that might call into question as we compare, as we try to evaluate one form of living against another. This is a different way that we can make sense through these types of modern buildings that produce maximum transparency for maximum seeing. These types of urban frames, like films or like photographs, show us different aspects in some relationship as senses, particularly visual, that we have to make sense of in terms of logic. You can see examples of this showing up in films. Here's a representation from a film showing what the future of transport and governance would look like. And this is obviously showing, the highway system of Los Angeles projected in a large dome, and people are watching this, as a spectacle. You can imagine in mod London in the 60s, you could never have enough views of what's behind you. And this acceleration, this conspicuous consumption, the mod culture of London that gave rise to the British high-tech movement, was this accumulation and celebration of not just technology, but as Baudelaire and others said, to be absolutely modern. To be absolutely modern meant to be living in the moment and anticipating the future. And in the same way, you can imagine the skyscrapers and the other buildings of the city being more and more like these mirrors added on. The visibility and the framing, the visions of images inside images, spaces inside spaces, become so commonplace to us that we are shocked when we find things that are opaque or solid or historical. We are used to living in a world where images superimpose on each other, not producing meaning, but challenging sense. Here we look at this image and we can see, and you can tell where we are, and we can look into the space, we can see the space behind us, and we have an ambiguity. Where are we? How do we make sense of this? At the same time, we look at this and we know it's a photograph and it's a reflection of light, because the sheet of glass has two sides, an inner side and an outer side, and both of them are reflecting what's behind them in this representation. This situates us in the city. It also situates us as a spectator, as an observer, and it also situates us in very close proximity to that boundary between the inside space and the outside space. We have an ambiguity, a mediated space that's being framed simply through plate glass window technology. But doesn't all media do this? Doesn't all media make us come too close and still stay outside of what we're observing? Marina City, as an iconic building, was developed and intended to offer a new form of living and to do it in a way that construction was efficient and also cost effective. At the same time, because there was an emphasis on the aesthetics and the shaping of it, of creating a unit so that no one could look into each other, and each of them was subdivided on the same efficient circular structure, the building is iconic. There is no other building in the city that has the same shape or the prominent position. It was intended to be a landmark from the moment it was made, but is a landmark that you can rent and live living space out of. And it was used quite extensively as a marker. When you see these two buildings, whether you like this style or not, you'll always think of Chicago. And you can see how it looks like corn on the cob. Those of you who like corn on the cob, even small children recognize the imagery, which is not accidental. So this became a marker of the city. This is the Bilbao effect before the Bilbao building, where the Marina City, or the corncob buildings, as everyone calls them, tells you you're in the American Midwest, in the agricultural zone, and you're in a large city, as you can see here. It becomes a place where, as again, stage sets. It marks, as in this advertisement, a certain distinction and elegance. It marks a certain technological advancement. It also marks that conspicuous culture of consumption of people recently empowered through upward mobility, usually through education in the GI Bill, to get an education, to purchase a property, to have a vehicle, to have even things like a microwave and television, all as status symbols and all as a necessary part of keeping up with the present. And as you can see here, a stash of whiskey is not so bad, particularly if you know the history of Chicago, where they banned alcohol for quite a few years and produced a certain Prohibition-era aesthetic in terms of music, lifestyles, clothing. Go watch all of the TV series, the old black and white series, The Untouchables, to see all of the different Al Capone-era hijinks that happened. This is a studio's design project of how to take existing brutalist buildings and to green them. There's one approach towards greening a building, which has to do with actually turning it into a living organism. The second one would think about it in terms of not greenwashing, but thinking about how to get other systems, urban metabolism, flows of different things like light and waste, electricity, use passive systems. There are much more technologies available now than there were when I was a student for people to make buildings that are respectful or productive or helpful for the environment. There are even technologies that can start to clear pollution out of the air or out of the water and absorb that into the buildings or to distribute them into places for collection. This facade drawing here and the idea of using not just plants but algae to produce energy is an old idea. but it's something that's increasingly being taught in design schools and people are increasingly expecting. Chicago was one of the first cities, I think, in the United States to require all government buildings with flat roofs to have roof gardens placed on them. And this was done long before it became, I think, the convention in other places. And the idea of creating green roofs in Chicago on government buildings led to people in other environments also producing green roofs as a type of feature, cynically, that drove the real estate market. So in the little bit of time we have left, I want to talk about, this is one of the first computers. This is at MIT, and this is the first computer that had random access memory. Your phone actually has more processing power than what you're looking at here. But at the time, computation, the ability to use computation in developing models, drawings, maps, and other forms of tracking in the city was a fantasy that came true during the space age. It creates the opportunity to start to think about how to make these landmark buildings or how to make iconic buildings in other environments and how to use technology and computation to do that. This high-tech museum, the Pompidou Center, was actually done and designed by hand to look high-tech. It is composed of space-age technologies, joints, seams, exterior circulation. It was even designed so that you could change the floor levels, that you could move them up and down like on a toy. They haven't been moved as far as I know, but the building was intended to be flexible, to be constructed as something that could be modified, although it hasn't been modified. And it's become an urban icon and created a large public space in front of it where people no longer come to photograph it because it's pretty well known and established, but as a cultural institution, as a museum, and also as a public space adjoining it, it becomes a popular space in the city for people to socialize. The plaza next to the museum becomes a new table, a new ground for different sorts of relationships and correlations to develop. You can see a different version of this. Peter Cook of Archigram fame later formed a studio called Crab, and this is their art museum in Graz in Austria. It's sometimes called the Friendly Alien, and it is also an attempt to use the museum typology, which is an institution of the long history in the city, as something also as an experiment to try to produce an icon. So here, a high-tech geometry using the laminated ceramic systems and skylights at the top that come from the aerospace industry, doing a technology transfer and taking them down to the level of an individual building. It is a building that is intended to serve a function, but as a museum, it is also supposed to call attention to the city of Graz itself. The Bentham Crowell addition to the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, sometimes jokingly called the bathtub, as you can see why, is almost a hyper-modern inversion of the conventional museum you see there. In Amsterdam, and particularly the Rijksmuseum, which this is next to, these different buildings follow the historical patterns of that later Renaissance and early Baroque period of Amsterdam's golden age. This building challenges all of that. The open plaza in front moves through the building, as in many modern buildings, as it is left just as a glass wall. And as you move into the interior atrium, then you will take the transport systems up to see the artwork, which is in the white part, which is enclosed. This is a hypermodern institution where people will expect the museum to be different from the fabric, to call attention to itself, to break the pattern of repetition, to break the context, and to stand apart is what allows us to recognize it as an icon and make sense of it as a deliberate point of intensity, to recognize it as a point of difference, to recognize it as a new stimulus or a new sensation. Architecture influences people, as I mentioned, and people influence the architecture. One of the more controversial buildings when it was designed in New York is not even a building. The Apple Store has no functional space above ground. It is quite literally a logo superimposed on glass, and the building is actually below the ground, the display room. And if you've ever gone to an Apple Store now, they've become such a strong aesthetic. In many ways, the stylistic integrity across the different commodities that are made. The store designs each of them following increasingly dovetailing towards a certain design solution. The Apple brand has become a type of urban spectacle. And here, the one in New York on Fifth Avenue, it's a building that deliberately disappears, but also is right there and is very visibly present in terms of the levitating logos. In the city of New York, and I'll finish here because I lived there for a little bit, although Chicago will always be home. In the city of New York, you can also nowadays use GIS software and other techniques to make sense of the city. You can track crime or property values by postcode or even down to individual buildings and produce not just new data sets, but new visualizations of that data, which are useful for a variety of functions. Everything from transport to shopping to thinking about where to move and tracking which schools will be the best over time. All of the forecasting and all of the data that we have available to us often needs a wrapper or a package or some sort of framing or mediation. And this is something we often call datascapes. You can also map your senses. You can think about, and here you can see this is actually a photograph of a project called sensory mapping. And if you look in the horizontal bar, you can see there's an 8-hour flight from Amsterdam to, where is this going? New York, of course. And in this flight, everything from the meals, the laboratory, the landing, finding your seat, departure, all of this has been organized and mapped. So you can actually map not just cities, you can map how you sense in cities. And you can use this as a user experience, a customer journey, a participant experience, and you can actually start to measure, map, and then design the experiences people will have in a space too. So this is something I've been talking with students in both universities I'm working with about how to make sense of things and how to make that sense making itself a series of drawings or data collections. The buildings in Times Square are iconic. They have been branded as a kind of open-ended competition. It's a competitive environment between advertisers to gain people's attention. It's a bit like inhabiting a video game or some other sort of media platform littered with advertisement that are composed in direct dialogue with each other. Times Square is one of the most dynamic spaces in the city, filled with tourists who come to wonder at its spectacle. One advantage that allowed this to happen was the closing off of the street traffic for a couple of blocks and turning the crossroads here into a pedestrian zone. So there's a strong message here for people who are interested in increasing the iconic qualities and the tourist popularity of contemporary cities is to make these pedestrian-friendly zones and to make them filled with things that people value. For example, in a lot of the public space, and I've been to Times Square countless times when I was working in New York as a professor and lecturing in a design firm on Canal Street and then later down on Wall Street. As I walked through this plaza a couple times a day, there would be different activities. Here you can see they're setting up in what used to be a public street, a performance area. And you see people sitting and having drinks. You see people setting up for the performance. I've seen people doing yoga, magic tricks. Almost anything you could do in a neighborhood park is often done now in Times Square. And you've got high density, it's high security because of the popularity as well as the tourists. And as a transport hub, you've got public transport of multiple kinds right at the periphery too. So Times Square, although it is often ridiculed by New Yorkers as being too commercial or too touristy, is a very popular place for people to use as a naturalized or normalized neighborhood space, but is one of the most dense and is one of the most heavily mediated and branded environments you can find in the United States. It's an example of both the strengths and some of the weaknesses of thinking of spaces as types of media. And where this is going to lead us to is an augmented reality. Not just the entertainment value of Pokemon Go, but thinking about the entire environment as a place where one has both physical or material conditions and then digital or the augmented conditions on top of it. Here you can see how you could access in a commercial sense different forms of data. The web or the internet tracking your movements and superimposing itself on this vision of reality. This augmented world already exists, and it exists even before the buildings or the spaces are designed or changed, because we use augmented reality when we design these things, and later the world is tested against them and evaluated against our expectations of how augmented living occurs. So making sense of things now often includes technology and particularly streaming media. We can no longer look or think about occupying photographs. We live in a world of streaming data and streaming media, which includes all of the sounds and all of the smells and all of the photons and images that are coming into our eyes and our hands and our ears And this is because we are still sensing beings. We still understand the world through our body, and our mind is carried through the cities, whether we have our phone on or off, as a device for observation and for movement. And with that, I think I will bring my talk to a close and see if anyone is still here and if anyone still has any questions.
Yes, of course. Thank you very much. Your lecture was amazing. Of course, we have a question. I took notes during the lecture, and I have a question. During the lecture, you talk about how the perception of space and architecture has changed. Do you think the pandemic could change the perception of space?
Yes. It has not only changed the perception of space, it's placed huge demands on it. Some of the first things that happened when the pandemic occurred was a lot of people scrambled as they learned that they were going to be often in a lockdown situation. A lot of people scrambled to either collect resources as you would in a natural disaster, or some people scrambled to get home. Here at our university in India, for example, when they decided to send the students home, some of them got trapped in airports as different curfews were imposed. Some people were caught between places. The first thing that people noticed after that pandemic happened was the fragility of the supply chains. People didn't know in the pandemic or in the lockdown that happened how to get basics like food or water. And so people became very conscious, I think, for the first time of how fragile modernized life was. Another thing that happened that I've seen here was at first a belief that it would be temporary or short term. And then as it became a longer new normal, as it was jokingly called, even the principles of social distancing became challenged. And we've seen that happen in a lot of countries. The countries that responded in a more strict way about possibilities of contamination or proximity as a way of flattening the curve, as they called it, also had a variety of different types of social and even mental conditions happening. We noticed this with students too in teaching online, that the students are learning in a different way, but they're also feeling more isolated. So I think what it's done is help people realize, either in a positive way or negative way, what is important to them. Some people have used this as an opportunity to think through what the future could be like. Some industries suffered quite heavily. There's companies that say, for example, design sports stadiums that are struggling to think, how can we make stadiums in the future if we have to stay 2 meters apart from each other? There's opportunities for people to think about new ways of doing things. People became much more self-reliant as a necessity. And in some ways, I think people started to appreciate what they had taken for granted beforehand. At the same time, the pandemic and the restraining conditions are still in place and still happening as well. And so there's no end in sight. My colleagues often split themselves into two groups: those that think that we will go back to a pre-pandemic world, just a little bit wiser. And there's others who think that we cannot go back to that world, that we have to do things in a new way. And I think more of the progressive and more of the sustainable arguments that people have made in the past are getting more attention now because of the situation too. So the health crisis has challenged everything from education to housing to food security. But I think it's also emphasized the human condition and our dependence on our environment, our dependence on the proximity of things, our need to be close to everything from green space to open space, to being close but not too close to our neighbors. Even these fundamental values, I think, are being called into attention as people recognize their significance as it's shaped their lives leading up to the pandemic. But for example, in my field, in architecture and education, we can't go back to the way things were. Even nowadays, laying out dining areas for different institutions because of the physical distancing, not social distancing. Because of physical distancing, the volumes of spaces have to be much larger. Density has to go down. Supply chains have to have backups. And here in India, for example, a lot of the soft infrastructure replaced the hard infrastructure as roads were literally blocked and closed, and airports and trains were shut down on short notice. It used to be that your affluence determined your speed of movement through a city. Even access to movement became a high privilege, high priority class marker here. If you were allowed to move about freely, you must have been very important when people were ordered to stay in their houses for long periods of time. These debates are happening everywhere. Everything from diplomacy to sanitation have been disrupted by this. And it's fascinating too, because it's made a lot of people realize the interconnectedness of these different issues as well. So yeah, particularly for designers, it's a very challenging and interesting time, because people are finally talking about values now and not simply efficiency and profit. Other values have crept into the conversations, which I think is good.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I would like to encourage all of you who are watching this live lecture to ask your questions on the chat on YouTube. But also I have one more question to you, Thomas.
Yep.
Could you let us know, in your opinion, what actions should Earth experts like architects, but also the representatives of other fields of science, what actions should they take to face new needs, new tools, or new threats that we have, new expectations?
Okay. In some of the courses I've been working with the students, we were talking about how the ability to perceive or make sense of the world is increasingly been shifted to technologies like cameras, CCTV, and increasingly they're in automated or passive systems. So buildings will have sensory data that will check the temperatures and adjust their, say, air conditioning without humans getting involved. Transport systems have increasing this sensors too. And if you can imagine the fantasy of the Internet of Things, where every individual plant in a crop would have a sensor, and there would be automatic water or soil chemistry adjustments based on the sensory data. It is quite possible in affluent industries to have this, I guess, augmented or smart city approach, where data is constantly collected and modify and balance automatically. We're not able to do that at large scales consistently, as far as I know, in too many places. But the technologies in principle are all there, and the desire for that is there as well. The other big challenge that we're facing, besides the development of these supplemental automated systems, which take some control and some judgment away from humans. So there's a danger there that science fiction films usually point out. But the other danger we're facing, and this is particularly the case in India, is the rising seas, and how most of the cities of the world tend to be very close to the coasts or along waterways historically. And so cities like where I taught before in Shanghai, when people say, the city will be under 3 more meters of water in the next 10 years. Cities like Miami, Florida, that are projected to have nuisance flooding at the scale that becomes a new normal. The second biggest challenge for scientists is also how to solve these so-called wicked problems. There is an argument that has been made that to solve a wicked problem, you actually have to work across disciplines. You cannot have scientists solving scientific problems exclusively. You cannot have engineers solving a water engineering problem exclusively. And I'll use a very simple example from our field. If you want to design a different type of library, because nowadays libraries, books are not as popular as they used to be, although I love books, I love libraries. A lot of times now libraries have things included in them to make them more service-oriented institutions. A lot of the university libraries will have coffee shops in them. A lot of them will also have maker spaces or other sorts of social interaction or production spaces, gathering spaces. Increasingly, the books will be displaced or digitized to make room for other sorts of social space too, to create different sorts of, I guess, knowledge cultures or social cultures. As a consequence, libraries are going through rapid transformations. And it doesn't make librarianship or libraries obsolete. What it means is they have to have flexibility, versatility, and diversification. As a consequence of that, when you're designing a library, it used to be okay to have architects, engineers, and librarians in the conversation, but now, And this is for everyone who's not in the design field. Now, to make a good library, you need to have politicians, grandmothers, the garbage men, and as many different voices and as many different potential lifestyles that are touched by the library involved in the design process, so that the designs can be more resilient, more robust, more inclusive, and more accessible. So as a consequence of any sort of problem or wicked problem, if you diversify the knowledge base and you include local people and you include non-experts in those conversations, you will come up with usually a much more sophisticated design. It doesn't mean that people who are not engineers get to make engineering decisions, but it means engineers working with people who are not engineers will be pressured increasingly to consider other points of view and to think about other forms of inclusion. And this gets us towards the principle of universal design, which is a much older principle, not just of barrier-free environments, but creating environments, which includes landscape, buildings, infrastructure, to create environments that universal design wants us to have environments that everyone can access and use. It does not discriminate based on your age, your degree of mobility, perceived disabilities, status, gender, or any of those other, markers that people use to classify people. How do you design spaces now that are inclusive is probably the biggest challenge that comes out of these crises as well. So it's not enough to solve a technical problem with a technical solution. A good idea is something that solves multiple problems with one solution at the same time. And that requires interdisciplinarity. People have to learn to speak outside of their profession in a meaningful way to people in other fields. And it's hard for architects, it's hard for engineers, it's hard for lawyers to, I've learned, to speak to people that aren't in their field. And doctors, I don't even want to talk about that one. It's almost like a Tower of Babel situation where all of the experts are talking to other experts in their field and have a harder time, I think, to communicate. So teaching those skills in university is actually one of the biggest challenges we have, so that people who are developing an expertise, not job training, but an expertise, people who are developing an expertise in something, some knowledge system, have to be able to communicate to people who are non-experts. And that's actually one of the challenges I had in this lecture as well, too. I was told, don't be too philosophical when you're teaching philosophy. I'm like, that's hard, but you got to do it.
Thank you. That's interesting that you are telling to us. Okay, Professor Michael, thank you very much for making time and to give this interesting lecture for us. Also, thank you to the Metropolis that funded the possibility of organizing this lecture, and another lecture that is going to take place next Friday. And there will be on next Friday, also at 1:30, there will be a lecture entitled Architectural Intelligence and Multiple Ecologies. So already today, we would like to invite you all to join us again to hear to the second lecture. That will be the continuation of our today's meeting, I think.
I think so, yes. We'll talk more about nature and ecologies and some of those questions that you guys raised today. I will try to get some more illustrations of that for next time. So I hope people will come back.
Okay, so thank you very much for being with us today and for watching this lecture, and see you next Friday.
Okay.
Bye.
Everyone stay healthy.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.